The canister hit the steel table with a sharp metallic crack, still warm from the aircraft. The kind of sound that made everyone in the review room look up at once, because that sound meant someone had died in the sky. This was early summer, years before digital certainty, when war was captured on fragile strips of film and truth lived between frames. The footage came from a forward airstrip carved out of jungle and red dust, not from Thailand, but from a battered Allied base on a Mediterranean island late in the war. A place where fighters landed riddled with holes and crews counted surviving aircraft like blessings. Standard procedure followed automatically. Technicians inspected the gun mechanisms. Intelligence officers leaned in close to the projector. Pilots folded their arms and argued quietly about angles and timing. Except this reel showed something wrong. No muzzle flash. No tracers stitching the air. The enemy fighter filled the frame for a heartbeat, perfectly centered. Then a white bloom swallowed it whole. One moment a machine, the next a storm of fragments spinning away into nothing. Lieutenant Arthur Hale was on the controls, steady hands, calm breathing. Behind him, Captain Daniel Cross had been calling the intercept, voice tight, tracking the target on crude wartime radar that most men no longer trusted. It was their fourth confirmed destruction in barely a month, and the room felt it. That shift in the air when history leans forward. The camera kept running after the explosion, fixed on empty sky as debris scattered like ash. No parachute appeared. Enemy records later would say the pilot lived, burned and broken, dragged from the wreckage by farmers, but in that room no one knew that yet. Someone finally said it out loud. One more, and Hale would be an ace. That was the shock. Nobody expected it to happen this way. The new guided weapon they were testing had a reputation already, and it wasn't heroic. Crews called it the miracle promise because it almost never delivered. On paper, it could kill from beyond gun range. In the air, it lost luck, chased clouds, died dumb and blind. Most pilots ignored it and trusted their cannons. Hale didn't. His first victory weeks earlier had come from one of those unreliable weapons. The second took 2 launches, 1 failure, 1 hit. The third followed the same pattern. And now this. 4 long-range kills while other men still closed to knife-fight distances. The film ended. They rewound it. Watched again. The explosion happened exactly where the weapon should have struck. Hale would score once more before the war burned itself out, again without firing his guns. 5 victories, all from guided strikes. Decades would pass without another like it. The record survived when the film did not. Mission logs, sworn statements, radio calls crackling with tension, enemy loss reports that matched time and sky. That evidence carried his name forward. But it almost never happened at all. Hale had wanted to fly with the elite interceptor wing from the beginning, the unit with the victories painted under their canopies, commanded years earlier by legends whose names still echoed through briefing rooms. They didn't want him. On his first tour, he'd been stuck in the rear seat of a different squadron, flying support, bombing rail yards and convoys, watching contrails of others climbing toward glory. He went home with nothing, so he fought the system instead. Letters, recommendations, politics. When he returned, it was to the front seat, to a newer aircraft with better eyes, better reach, and a chance at redemption. He arrived thin, focused, carrying the quiet anger of a man who had waited too long. This time, the elite unit needed pilots. This time, they opened the door. And that single frame of exploding metal was the hinge on which the rest of his story turned. The order came down fast, clipped and impersonal, like all orders that mean the war is about to change shape. Veteran crews rotated back into the fight because the enemy had pushed too far, and now the hammer was coming down. A new bombing campaign rolled into motion after the spring offensive cracked open old fronts, and suddenly, experience mattered more than raw brilliance. Hale had that experience, even if most of it was spent staring at ground targets through smoke and flak instead of hunting fighters. He knew the corridors, the choke points, the invisible lines where radar coverage thickened and missiles grew teeth. He also knew, quietly, that he wasn't the sharpest stick in the unit. That wasn't an insult. It was arithmetic. The elite wing in that season was stacked with survivors and prodigies. Men like Thomas Larkin, who had lived nearly a month evading capture after being shot down. Like Peter Knox and Daniel Cross, who would later carve their own names into the record books from the back seat. Like pilots who already carried victories from earlier tours like scars you could almost see. Hale had none. Zero. His first real chance came on a gray morning at the end of March, escorting strike aircraft toward a heavily defended industrial zone near the enemy's capital. 4 fighters in formation, radios tight, eyes up. The intercept warning came too late, enemy jets dropping in from above exactly as doctrine said they would. Hale rolled hard, nose coming up, radar painting a clean return. He didn't hesitate. He launched. The missile behaved against precedent and reputation, and the enemy aircraft vanished in a flash that felt unreal, even as it happened. The man in the rear seat that day, Lieutenant Mark Ellis, called it clean. Command later called it shared. Ellis would be gone before the next fight, rotated home by the calendar, replaced by Cross in early April. That pairing changed everything. Cross was calmer, sharper, his voice steady even when the scope went wild. Hale trusted him without thinking, and that trust turned into rhythm. They flew together for months, a quiet machine inside the larger war, stacking engagements that would later add up to 6 enemy aircraft destroyed, 4 together, 2 more Cross would earn after Hale's tour ended. In April, though, none of that was visible yet. Hale had one victory and a reputation that barely rose above competent. Reliable, procedural. The kind of officer instructors like and legends ignore. He followed manuals. He respected systems, which explained why he kept firing a weapon everyone else had written off as a bad idea. The guided missile he favored had humiliated itself earlier in the war, an abysmal record that pilots recited like a curse. Hundreds fired, a handful hit. Heavy, temperamental, blinded by weather and tricked by simple maneuvers. Enemy pilots learned quickly how to break its gaze, how to vanish into clutter, how to force it to chase ghosts. Other weapons worked better, still imperfect but honest. Heat seekers that locked onto engines and guns that answered instantly. Most victories came from those. Hale ignored the consensus. By the time he arrived for his second tour, the weapon had changed just enough to be dangerous again. Better internals, fewer failures, but hardware alone didn't explain what followed. Tactics did. Hale and Cross stopped treating the missile like a long-range miracle and started using it like a knife thrown at exactly the wrong moment. They fired when the enemy was crossing their nose, not fleeing. They attacked from angles doctrine discouraged, where closure rates were brutal and reaction time vanished. Cross held radar lock through maneuvers that should have broken it, hands light, mind ahead of the scope. They fired in pairs, not hope shots, but traps. The first launch forced the enemy to break. The second arrived while he was still moving, still blind. It wasn't luck, it was method. And it worked often enough that people began to notice. Names mattered to Hale more than most men admitted. Missiles weren't just numbers to him. They were language, and language revealed how seriously a system had been thought through. The sparrow was the sparrow because it hunted straight and fast, not because it wandered. The Sidewinder wasn't a joke about movement either. It was a rattlesnake, a heat hunter that struck without warning. Other weapons had beautiful names and ugly histories. The Falcon sounded lethal and elegant and failed spectacularly in combat. The Phoenix would arrive later, its name borrowed from a desert city where it was born, though the manufacturers smiled when people imagined fire and rebirth instead. Hale understood all of that. But what mattered now was performance. By the middle of that brutal year, the Sparrow's overall record had clawed its way up to something like 15%. Still awful. Still distrusted. Hale's personal record didn't care. 5 launches against enemy fighters between spring and late summer. 5 clean destructions. No misses, no maybes. That kind of perfection in a system defined by failure gets noticed. Other crews started watching how he flew, how his backseater talked, how they waited for angles that felt wrong until they worked. A few copied the method and found success. Others tried and failed and went back to heat seekers and cannons. There was another detail nobody liked to mention out loud because it sounded ugly when budgets met blood. Each sparrow cost more than most families earned in years. A sidewinder was cheap by comparison. Gun rounds were almost an afterthought. Every time Hale squeezed the trigger, he was throwing a small fortune into the sky. 5 times, 5 returns. No wasted shots, no gun fired. Even the accountants couldn't argue with that. Across the border, people were paying attention too. Enemy intelligence summaries began circulating warnings about a particular American crew that was breaking their radar defenses. No names yet, just patterns, just fear. They knew something had changed. Part of the confusion that followed came from how victories were counted on opposite sides of the same sky. Hale's side demanded evidence layered on evidence. Film, witnesses, tapes, confirmations from intelligence units piecing together wreckage reports. Claims died on desks. Pilots waited months to learn if what they saw counted. The enemy system was simpler and faster. If your commander believed you and your wingman backed you, the victory was yours. Cameras were rare. Certainty was flexible. That difference warped the numbers. One side recorded hundreds of enemy aircraft destroyed. The other acknowledged a fraction of that as actual losses. Neither was entirely lying. They were measuring chaos with different rulers. A pilot fires, sees fire and smoke, watches an enemy dive away, and believes. A damaged aircraft limps home unseen, or doesn't. Sometimes nobody ever knows. Hale's record lives inside that fog. His first victory lines up cleanly with enemy losses, date and place matching like a solved equation. Later fights blur together. Multiple missiles in the air, multiple claims, victories overlapping in the same violent minutes. On one day in May, several men on both sides would swear they shot down the same aircraft. The tallies probably add up. Probably. One engagement cuts through the uncertainty like a blade. The fight days later, the one captured on film, the one where the enemy aircraft vanished exactly where it should have. That kill stands solid. Steel truth in a war of guesses. The file finally gave up a name, a number scratched into fading ink, the kind of detail that makes history feel briefly obedient. Enemy fighter serial 7114, flown by pilot Tran Quang Min. He lived. He punched out. Hale owned that one cleanly. No argument. After that, the trail bends. Late summer brought the fight that crowned him, the engagement that should have closed every ledger neatly, and instead left a stain that never quite washes out. The final victory came on a humid morning at the end of August. Escort duty again. 4 fighters wrapping a strike package pushing toward the industrial heartland. Hale's call sign that day meant nothing special at the time, just another radio label, another routine mission number that would later harden into trivia. He and Cross picked up the thread early. Enemy fighters lifting northwest of the capital, tracked first by distant naval radar floating offshore, then by their own scope as the geometry slowly tightened. At first, the intercept didn't make sense. The enemy wasn't closing. They were crossing, skirting the edge of engagement, the kind of probing move meant to test reactions, not commit. Hale adjusted anyway, nudging the formation into a position that stole options. At 25 miles, the enemy turned in. That was wrong. Their doctrine favored speed and escape, not prolonged contact. Hale climbed, putting gravity on his side, Cross's voice steady as the radar picture sharpened. At 12 miles, Hale fired. The missile ran clean for seconds that stretched thin, then the lock broke. The enemy pilot reacted perfectly, dumping countermeasures, snapping into a defensive turn. Cross didn't hesitate. He shifted targets mid-fight, hands already moving, voice already calling the new solution. The second missile left the rail before the first had finished failing. This one held. 8 miles. Impact. The enemy aircraft came apart in a flash violent enough to punch through the canopy glare. That was 5. The one that made him an ace. On paper, anyway. American witnesses backed it. Somewhere, a camera recorded it. Enemy records, however, stayed silent. No loss logged. Every fighter listed as returning. No damaged aircraft. Nothing. Either a clerk miswrote a date, or a report vanished, or one side remembered wrong. Dig long enough and you find fragments that refuse to fit. A partial serial number buried in a degraded copy. An aircraft marked lost to air combat with no pilot name, no day attached, floating loose in the archive like a bone with no grave. It bothered me more than it should have. I wanted symmetry. War doesn't give it. By American rules, Hale had 5 confirmed victories. The other side acknowledged 4. For a half-century-old air war fought at closing speeds beyond human perception, that's close enough. No one knew at the time that this would be the last one that mattered. The war dragged on, but the opportunities didn't. Hale rotated home weeks later. The air campaign shifted toward bombers and suppression, then toward negotiations, then toward silence. When fighting flared again years later, it stayed on the ground. No American pilots hunting enemy fighters. No chances to build tallies. That explains the absence statistically, but not doctrinally. The deeper reason sits in the lessons drawn afterward. Planners looked at Hale's record and saw proof that long-range missiles had finally arrived. They built a future around distance, around radar screens and beyond visual range certainty. New fighters carried forests of missiles and, at first, no guns. Training narrowed. Close combat became an afterthought. Then the next war arrived and found no one willing to meet them in the air. Hale's name stayed at the top, not because he was unmatched, but because the world changed underneath him and never offered anyone else the same sky. The numbers after that war tell a story that feels anticlimactic if you expect legends to keep repeating. In the next major conflict, American pilots scored dozens of air victories, but almost all of them came from short-range shots. Heat seekers launched close enough to see rivets, because the elegant long-range battles everyone trained for never truly happened. Identification rules forced pilots to visually confirm targets. Radar contacts alone weren't enough, and by the time you could see the enemy, you were already inside the envelope where instinct mattered more than theory. No one piled up victories. The campaign moved too fast. The opposing air force either dissolved or refused to play along, choosing survival over glory. Since then, the pattern has hardened. Air superiority is established early, sometimes in hours, sometimes in days. Enemy fighters stay grounded, flee, or get erased before meaningful engagements can form. The sky never fills with adversaries long enough for tallies to grow. Hale's 5th victory marked the quiet end of an era, even if nobody in the cockpit realized it yet. Fighter culture still worships aces, still paints ghosts of old victories on squadron walls. But the math no longer works. The conditions that create aces don't exist anymore, and likely never will again. Years later, fragments from the other side of the war began to surface. Select archives cracked open, carefully chosen documents released, aging pilots allowed to speak cautiously to foreign historians. Not everything, never everything, but enough to sharpen the picture. Those records align with most of Hale's story, though always with footnotes and gaps. The early spring engagement matches cleanly. A fighter lost to a radar-guided weapon, pilot ejected and survived. The same man Hale would unknowingly face again weeks later. The chaotic May battles line up too. Losses acknowledged without assigning blame. Aircraft disappearing into the fog of overlapping claims and shared skies. One later fight stands out. Logged clearly by the other side as a radar missile kill. Pilot badly injured but alive. The kind of specificity that almost points directly back at Hale because so few others were succeeding that way at the time. And then there's the last one. The crowning victory that made the books close neatly on the American side and refused to close at all on the other. Every American record says it happened. Every enemy record says it didn't. Somewhere, a reel of film exists that could settle it, or could simply add another angle to the argument. Intelligence summaries say one thing, squadron logs say another. Opposing archives insist nothing was lost that day. Historians have argued over it for decades, circling the same possibilities without landing on certainty. A hidden loss buried for pride, a misinterpreted explosion, a date shifted by a tired clerk, or simply the truth dissolving under the pressure of speed, fear, and survival. One stray serial number haunts the margins, an aircraft listed as destroyed with no context, no pilot, no moment attached, like an orphaned fact looking for a home. It doesn't fit Hale. It doesn't fit anyone else either. War leaves those behind, loose ends that refuse to be tied. In the end, Hale stands as the last, not because his record is flawless, but because it sits at the exact intersection of opportunity, doctrine, and timing. After him, the sky changed. Not cleaner, not fairer, just emptier. Or maybe the simplest explanation is the cruelest one. Someone fired, lost sight, said nothing, and the enemy aircraft died alone somewhere beyond the fight, falling out of history without witnesses. Or maybe it was never combat at all, just ink betraying truth. A wrong serial number copied by a tired clerk in Hanoi in 1973, a single-digit misread, a year shifted, a mistake frozen into an archive that now refuses to explain itself. I wanted that loose end to matter, to resolve into a hidden victory or a forgotten loss, to reward the effort of digging. It doesn't. It just exists, a vanished MiG with an uncertain number and no story left to tell. War is full of those, details that lead nowhere, mysteries that don't pay off. 52 years have passed since Hale's fifth victory, and the silence afterward is louder than the combat that came before it. One service got its last ace days earlier, then the line snapped. This wasn't how fighter pilots thought history worked. Every generation expected its own legends. The pattern seemed inevitable, the lone hunter rising again and again with each new war. Then the math broke. Later conflicts moved too fast or ended too cleanly. Enemies stopped flying. Rules demanded certainty before firing, stripping away the long-range advantage everyone had trained for. Victories happened, but they were scattered, shared, capped at 2 here, 1 there, never enough to stack into mythology. After that came wars where the sky was never contested at all, where air power was absolute from the first night, where fighters hunted ground targets or nothing. Modern combat finished the job. Sensors spread across networks, missiles launched by one aircraft based on data from another, entire formations contributing to a single kill. Whose victory is it when 6 machines and dozens of people make one enemy disappear? Nobody's. The ace becomes obsolete not because pilots lack skill, but because war stopped needing individuals. Hale survives in that narrow seam of time, early enough to fight when fighters still met each other face to face, late enough to master a weapon system others had abandoned, precise enough to turn probability upside down. He isn't special because no one surpassed him. He's special because the world moved on and left no room for successors. His aircraft still sits quietly in a museum hall, paint dull, metal tired, looking less like a relic than a machine that just shut down after a long sortie. 5 small red stars rest under the canopy, easy to miss unless you know where to look. They mark something that no longer happens, not failure, not decline, an ending. Like the last cavalry charge, like the final battleship duel, like a door closing without ceremony. You can stand there and look at it, and if you understand what you're seeing, you realize you're not looking at a champion. You're looking at the last proof of a kind of war that doesn't exist anymore.